Hello, thank you all for joining us today. Since you signed up, you obviously know what you're here for. So we're going to talk about keeping consumers at the center of brand strategy and what does that mean? I'll give you a quick update of where we are in terms of percent of the population consuming, what's changed in the past year, some indication of why we've seen those changes across the US as well as by market. And then we'll jump into an actual walkthrough. We're going to do it a little different this webinar. If you've attended webinars in the past, typically what we do is we extract the data that BDSA has available to clients. We create more visual slides and content, and then share those out in more of a storytelling framework. We're still going to do the storytelling today, but I'm actually going to do it in screenshots of the platform. Don't worry, this is not a sales pitch if you're wondering whether or not you should drop off. It's just going to be a different way to look at how do we help our clients and how do you think about building a brand strategy utilizing all of the data that BDSA provides to our existing client base. And doing that instead of pulling it out and creating PowerPoint visuals, doing it with actual screenshots from the BDSA Green Edge platform. So pretty excited about this. If you do have questions, there's a question pop out within the platform, so definitely drop those in. If we have time, we'll get to them. If not, we will follow up with you. Also, this is being recorded as it was notified when the GoToWebinar started. So with that, let's jump in. So just a quick background for those of you who are new. BDSA is the go-to for cannabinoid or cannabis market research of today and tomorrow. Breaking this down into 3 key BDSA product solutions. The first being retail sales tracking. This is what we're most known for. This is tracking exactly what is selling, where, when, at what price point by day, week, month, quarter, year. We currently track 12 US markets. And when I say markets, I mean states. In most of those states where applicable, we also break the market into channels, adult use and medical. And again, that is driving exactly what's selling, where, when, at what price point, category through stages of categorization, down to brand, down to SKUs or products, and down to product attributes. We also have market forecasts, so taking all of the data that we collect on an ongoing basis and all of the data and information we've collected over the last 7+ years, we have predictive models for where the market will be over the next 5 years. Again, that is by state, that is by province in Canada, and in the US and Canada, that is also by state, by category, and by channel, and globally in 40+ countries. So again, that's the future outlook. Interestingly, we just dropped the most updated, the most up-to-date market forecast with our current clients last week. So there's a lot more coming in the next couple of weeks publicly as it pertains to our updated projections for the cannabis industry. The last piece, which we're going to focus on mostly today, is the consumer work. So understanding not just what's happening in the market, but understanding the who and the why behind the trends seen in the retail sales tracking data. As you consider market forecast and that future outlook, understanding the percent of the population consuming cannabis, also those not consuming cannabis, and the evolution of cannabis consumers from entering the market and being a consumer for the first time to becoming a more frequent consumer across form factors. So tracking that evolution over time. Consumer insights is something we conduct proprietary research every 6 months. It is comprehensive, again, by state in the US as well as by province in Canada. So just a quick peek overarching of who we are and what all we're covering. You'll see these product names, retail sales tracking, market forecast, and consumer insights pop up throughout this presentation. So when we jump in further, I wanted to just give a quick update on where we are in 2021. Where we were in 2021 and kind of where we're starting in 2022. It's kind of shocking for me. I'm sure as many of you feel the same way, that tomorrow is the 1st of March. But we'll still do a quick review of 2021 just to make sure everyone's grounded and on the same page. As I mentioned, we are rolling out our updated market forecast currently. I do not have those in here except for a quick sneak peek. But just note, we will be doing a detailed webinar on March 21st, covering all things global market sizing over the next 5 years. So where do we anticipate the US, the Canada, and the rest of the world, as well as US and Canada by province, by category, who are going to be those biggest drivers of change and growth over the next 5 years, again, both in the US and Canada. But with that, let's just jump in and talk about a little bit what happened in 2021. So 2021 growth and BDSA's 2022 expectations and projections are coming from 3 key buckets. And you'll see us talk about these quite often. First, we have mature states, and this is specific to the US. So mature states being California, Oregon, and Colorado. These markets continue to grow. However, the growth is slowing. We definitely saw a slowdown in the back half of last year in many of these more mature legal adult use markets. But last year we did see these markets grow between 2 and 10% year over year. So still growth, but not the large growth rates we'd seen in prior years. Again, not surprising as markets mature. And we can talk about it, but I'm not going to talk about it today. We talked about it in the last webinar, so check out the recording. There are a lot of, obviously, as many of you know, a lot of challenges right now in operating in California. So definitely take a look at that last webinar. We do cover that. The next bucket we have identified are new adult use or legal cannabis markets. These are going to be states like Illinois, Mass, Michigan, and so on. Also going to include new medical markets. These are markets we see extreme growth year over year. We're talking 60 to 80% year over year growth as the market expands, as retail landscape becomes bigger, as the consumer population increases, and so on. So you got those new markets. Then we have the emerging legal cannabis states. These are going to be states like New York, who are expected to shift regulations and yield huge contributions to forecasted growth out to 2026. So again, as we're thinking about the market, where it is today and where it's going to be, it's helpful to kind of bucket it into these 3 segments. As I mentioned before, BDSA's market forecast and consumer covers every US state by channel. Our retail sales tracking right now, that granular tracking of exactly what is selling where, when, at what price point, currently covers 12 US markets broken down by channel. So when we think about that consumer landscape, so again, the objective and the topic today is really thinking about keeping consumers and shoppers the center of your strategy. Where are we talking at the most macro level? Where is the market? And I'm sure many of you have seen these slides many times from BDSA, but we'll just hit you again. We're at about 75% of the adult population in the US being bought in to consuming cannabis. So you can see that broken down into 3 buckets. We have what we define as cannabis consumers, those who have consumed in the past 6 months. We have cannabis acceptors, those who do not currently consume but are open to it. Obviously a group that does drive growth year over year in the percent of the population consuming, but also in form factor consumption. And then the last group is rejectors. These are people who don't currently consume, nor are they open to it. Some of those have to do with their personal beliefs. Sometimes that has to do with the legal ramifications and or drug testing within their current job. So there's a lot of factors here that drive rejection. It doesn't mean that they're opposed to legal cannabis, a really important thing to call out. As we think about this number, 75% of adults being bought in, and even further looking at about 47% of adults in fully legal states being current consumers, compare that to other established industries, whether that's beverage alcohol, CPG, you name it. Within beverage alcohol, you see these numbers of penetration being about 65 to 75% on average by market. Again, looking at about 50% of the population consuming has seen tremendous growth over time. So let's jump in further and just break those numbers down into specific markets. So as I mentioned, we have this for every state and every province as well, but just a quick snapshot of a handful of markets. Definitions quickly, level 1 is going to be BDSA's aggregate of fully adult use legal states with a retail landscape. So it's not just that they've passed regulations, but that the market's actually open and operating. Then we have level 2 markets. These are going to be an aggregate look of just those medically legal markets. And then breaking down and looking at a handful, looking at Canada in total, Massachusetts, California, Colorado. Really interesting to think about the growth just in the last year. So across all of these, you see numbers hovering from around 40% up to 50%. And it's fascinating, and I'll call out Colorado specifically. If we go back to the initial round of research, because this is trended and available to our clients in a trended way, Colorado was about 23% of adults consuming cannabis in Q1 of 2017. So you think about that now being a 50% of adults consuming, huge growth even in those mature markets. I'd like to also call out that last year we had no markets at 50% or above, and now we have quite a few. So joining Colorado, we have Michigan, which is interesting because these newer adult use markets, they don't look like Colorado did in 2014. They look more similar to mature markets today. So we've got Michigan, Oregon, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, all above 50% of adults now consuming cannabis. Really fascinating to look at that evolution over time. Further, it's not just about penetration or the percent of the population consuming. We also have to take a look at form factor, cross form factor, as well as preferred consumption. So a lot of factors here to think about and consider. We have to look at, again, what is that trend over time? So it's not just percent of the population consuming, but it's that many of these people are consuming very frequently and across form factors. So what you're looking at in this chart is just a quick look at preference by form factor. However, really essential to understand is that not just because you prefer a single form factor does not mean you don't have need states and occasions within a day or a week in which you're utilizing other form factors. And that is very common, obviously, not surprising to most of you, to most cannabis consumers. Further, the percent of the population consuming is growing, the percent consuming across form factors is growing, and people are consuming more frequently. So I believe we're at about 70% of inhalable consumers in fully legal states consuming at least daily. So all of a sudden, those growth numbers that we talk about coming from mature, new, and legal markets, obviously a huge driver there is the markets opening and the retail landscape expanding, but also comes down to the consumption dynamics that are happening state by state and consumer to consumer. So as I mentioned, we're going to jump into an example case study, looking at kind of how to utilize and think about all of the data available to really drive a comprehensive strategy. So this is going to be anchored in the consumer data and kind of who are consumers, who are shoppers, what matters to them, who are they demographically, but also psychographically, behaviorally. Do they consume wine? Do they enjoy spending time with their family? Do they like to try new things? All of those things matter in terms of really unpacking who consumers are and why they're behaving the way they're behaving. So with that, quick case study example, wanted to narrow this down so that we were talking about a specific scenario, allowing kind of the story and the data to come to life. So today we're going to be looking at an existing California edible brand that is moving into Arizona. Let me be very clear. We are not focusing on a single brand. We are using this as our example. So the data you're going to see is example data. It is coming from the retail sales tracking and all of the other products from BDSA, but we're not anchoring this to a specific brand. So think more broadly of we're just assessing what is a top California edible brand and how might they think about moving into a new market like Arizona. So what we're going to walk through is understanding first the performance in the current market. So any brand or retailer expanding across markets, you guys all know this if you're in the cannabis industry, every state is essentially its own country. So if we do have any CPG, beverage, alcohol, financial services companies on this webinar, we are talking about the US essentially functioning like a global market where every state looks different in the framework and the regulations and the consumer population and behaviors we see. So first we want to assess why is the brand strong in the existing market. It's always important to assess existing performance before predicting or planning for future performance. Then we're going to size that addressable market in the expansion market. In this case, we're looking at Arizona. So what is the total addressable market size for an edible product within this new market? What does that market look like and how is it trending? And what percent of that share could this brand steal or take? Then unpacking and understanding everything that's going on in that market. So who's consuming, what are they consuming, why are they consuming, what are those trends and pricing dynamics happening in the Arizona market? And the last is really identifying how to enter into that market with what products and targeted to which consumers. You can see it here called out, but just a reminder, we're going to do this via screenshots and green edge. I'll be honest here, risk factor, right? We probably have some competitors on this call. But the benefit here is really seeing how these stories can be brought to life and how you could drive brand strategy directly through the data and the platform that we provide. I think a lot of times, as I mentioned before, we extract the data and then we build these new custom slides and PowerPoint visuals, which oftentimes creates questions of like, well, where did you get that from? And again, it's all coming from the platform. So today we're going to walk through the dashboards via screenshots. So let's start this assessment. As I mentioned, we're going to start by thinking about what is this brand? And again, you can see this is masked, so you don't know what brand that we're viewing. How is this brand performing in that current market of California? And you can see here, looking at monthly brand performance. So in our platform, being able to drill down to a singular brand in a single state, down to categories, and even down to products, being able to look, starting very high level, what's the trend in dollar sales and what's the trend in dollar share. And you can see here very positive, obviously, lines. Everybody would love to see these, and I'm sure many of you probably want to guess what brand this is. And actually, if any of you do want to guess, drop it in the questions and maybe we'll send out a little freebie for BDSA if you get it right. So looking at a top California brand and looking at what's gone on in the last year, this is just a quick view of performance. Like I said, assess your existing performance before expanding into a new market or to a new category. And it looks like this brand is ready to expand. There's something really strong here. Next, we want to look at this brand in more detail, right? So let's break that down further. That was just looking at the brand individually, really tracking that singular brand performance. But now what's going on in the market? Is this a competitive brand? Are they generating enough share? Are they on trend with the SKU availability and pricing? Again, before we enter Arizona, let's assess why this brand is strong in California. You can see here, and this is direct data from 2021. I'm sure some of you might want to be screenshotting. We're looking at the top 10 California edible brands, as well as the share of those top 10 edible brands within the edible category. So what this is telling you is 68% of these top 10 California edible brands dollars are associated with candy. Not surprising, if I were to drill into the next level of categorization, many of you would see most of that 68% is actually gummies, gummy being a subcategory of candy in the BDSA data structure. So again, thinking about where are these brands in terms of competition, also category share, and then also how are SKUs performing? And so yes, this data then goes down to that SKU and attribute level. So being able to track and rank SKUs. What are the top selling SKUs? As this brand enters Arizona, should the assortment be the same? Is the same product going to win in Arizona as it did in California? And many of you probably know this, but that is not always the case. We can see top brands across states. Let's talk about some edible brands like Wana or Kiva or Wild listed here that are in multiple states. Their top SKU is not consistent state by state. So it's important to unpack that. As I mentioned, not all states are created equal, and they sometimes function as different countries. So again, this data then flows around, allowing us to see trended SKU level data at that attribute level, milligram content, milligram ratios, flavors, pack counts, pack sizes, cartridge sizes, pre-roll counts, strains, you name it, we're tracking it. So now we know why we're strong in California, growing in sales and growing in share, and being a top performer in the market at the brand and SKU level. So what's going on in Arizona? So now that's our expansion market. So what at a high level is happening for Arizona edibles, and what did those trends look like in 2021? So taking a quick look here, we can see total dollar sales for edibles in Arizona. We can look at total unit sales. We can see the change year over year, as well as average retail price for edible products. Again, not always the best to look at edibles as a category because you might see price differentiation from gummy price pack architecture to chocolate to beverages, you name it. But just for this view, really quick summary of what we're looking at. A couple of things to call out here. Many of you are probably thinking this. Arizona is an interesting case to look at 2021 because it turned adult use legal. Also, just a caveat to methodology here, you see this big spike. This actually occurred prior to the state, but because of BDSA's methodology and coverage of markets and projecting the data, definitely always looking to have a trended view before we release our next market or channel. So there's a little bit of lag there. That has nothing to do with the credibility of the data set, but I did want to call that out if anyone thought this looked weird, given Arizona went adult use legal and had adult use sales prior to what you see here from the BDSA tracking. But again, now we understand our California performance and Arizona edible market looking strong and growing. So what's going to happen next? As I mentioned, what's that total addressable market? What can we potentially snag? So when we're looking at this and thinking about BDSA's market forecast, as a reminder, direct screenshots from our platform. You can see some slightly ugly miscolored boxes because I'm hiding the data. We cannot give away everything in these presentations, so there is a little bit of hidden values in this presentation that you would have full access to the data. But again, thinking 5 years out, this is that projected market forecast. Where does BDSA anticipate the Arizona market to be, both adult use, medical, and illicit sales over the next 5 years? And what's that category makeup? So the first chart you're looking at is that trend of medical market to opening at adult use, and what do we expect to happen over the next 5 years? Thinking about where Arizona has been, any further changes we expect in regulations, and looking at surrogate markets who have had multiple years of adult use sales to kind of drive where this market's going to be over the next 5 years. Then breaking that projection down by category. The orange in this visual is actually edibles, so let's drill in there. So when we think about that edible marketplace, again, we're a California top edible brand moving into Arizona. Does this suggest a strong growth? Arizona, as a total market, is outpacing the growth of an average US market, not surprising given the state and the maturity of legalization. And within edibles, it is growing. Shares relatively constant and expected to remain constant over the next 5 years. So edibles are not anticipated to outpace the growth of the total Arizona market, but they're going to be on pace with the growth of the market. So you can see that visual here as that orange bar gets bigger and bigger as you go out to 2026. Another interesting angle to look at here, and it actually would suggest that maybe you should reconsider moving into Arizona. Maybe there's another market with a bigger total addressable market. Because what we've done here is we've broken out the BDSA forecast, and instead of looking by state, look by category and understand the contribution of future edible sales by state. Not surprising to see California as the behemoth here, given the size of the market and the fact that it's the largest legal cannabis market globally. And interestingly, Arizona's not on this picture. That doesn't mean there's not a critical or key opportunity here. It's just something worth considering of that total addressable market size for edibles by state is lower in Arizona than a handful of other states as we look out the next 5 years. All right, so we've got this growing market in Arizona. We have an expected $1.5 billion Arizona market in 2022. Where's that coming from? And as we break this down, really think about what's driving that. Obviously, regulatory conditions, greater availability, destigmatization, education. But when we also look at Arizona specifically, and again, this is real data, giving away a lot here. When we look at Arizona trended market overview, as I said in an earlier slide, we're breaking the population into consumers, acceptors, and rejectors. As we break this down and look at where we are as of the back half of 2021, you know, over 50% of adults are consuming cannabis. So seeing that market growth, seeing a $1.5 billion Arizona market in 2022 is not surprising as we assess that trended growth of the percent of the population consuming cannabis going back to the beginning of 2018. So let's unpack these cannabis consumers further, because this is just at the total representative, that census representative population of adults in Arizona. We are tracking 51% of those to be cannabis consumers in Arizona. Break this down further, and of those cannabis consumers, and just wanted to do a quick comparison again, California edible brand moving into Arizona, what's the difference? You know, understanding those differences to then adjust your brand strategy is crucial, and this allows that comparison view. So thinking about, again, that 51% of adults consuming in cannabis in Arizona, You can see here, 76% of them have consumed an edible, and 34% of them actually prefer edibles. So I want to call it out straight up here. When we're looking at this scenario, as we continue to walk through these slides, we have essentially started thinking about a target consumer profile that's kind of anchored in form factor. Form factor being, who are edible consumers in Arizona and how do they differ from California edible consumers? This is a relatively simple way to anchor a consumer target strategy. We'll talk about it further as we go through this presentation. It could be anchored in things like form factors. It could be anchored in terms of frequency of consumption, so heavy, medium, and light consumers. Or if you're a retailer, we could think about heavy, medium, and light shoppers based on spend. These can be attitudinal segments, behavioral segments, they can be occasion-based segments, a lot of different ways to think about a brand strategy anchored to target consumers or shoppers. But in this example today, we took a relatively simple approach, and we're really thinking about form factor as being that anchor. So if we go further, so we saw 76%, let me go back really quickly, 76% use edibles in Arizona, 34% preferring edibles. And we can even, as I mentioned before, I want to show the value here, look at that trend line over time. So edibles right here, you can see this middle line growing. Generally, the right trend line you're looking for in terms of the percent of the population preferring edibles in Arizona. So again, we want to assess what is the current product landscape and brand landscape for cannabis edibles in Arizona. We want to know what that 5-year forecast is, and we want to know that the consumer population is growing and that interest in this form factor is growing as well. That shows strength of the market and a larger opportunity over time. So from here, anchored in that form factor view, we can drill in and look at the demographic profiles of a California edible consumer versus an Arizona edible consumer. Demographics obviously super helpful in thinking about targeting, communicating to people as they walk into a dispensary, cross-sell, upsell opportunities, really beneficial. However, keep in mind, it's not just the demographics that drive how people consume or behave. There's a lot more that goes underneath that. But did want to show at a basic level, we can look at that Arizona edible consumer versus California and call out key differences. We're not going to go into too much detail, but you can see here, if we look at that gender split, edible consumers in Arizona tend to skew more female than male, and even more so than what we see in California, closer to a 50-50 split. So this is, again, really important to think about brand strategy entering a new market if that consumer looks different. That might suggest you need to adjust retailer or bud tender training. You might need to adjust your strategy on what stores make sense for you to prioritize getting distribution in. It might mean that you need to consider your product lineup and which SKUs to put as your #1 in a new market that you're really pushing based on kind of the consumer population looking and behaving differently. So you also want to know what your target consumer wants. So further thinking beyond just edibles into why. Why are they buying what they're buying? What matters to them? Within edibles, obviously really crucial to think about milligram content and ratios. So it's pretty easy to see here, not surprising, you know, that 5 to 10 milligram bucket be the top. Here we're looking at more than 10 to 20 in terms of their ideal THC dosage level. Again, Arizona edible consumers. And what matters to them? How much of the following influence your purchasing decisions? And interestingly, high THC content and low price are top 3 purchase influencers among edible consumers in Arizona. So what we would want to do is say, okay, this is really interesting and insightful. How does this compare to California? But also, does this align with what is actually selling in Arizona today? So you might flip the switch and say, now I want to look back at actually what's selling in the market. So this is, again, going back to that retail sales tracking. What is selling where, when, at what price point in Arizona? And we can confirm that that hypothesis is correct, that consumers are telling us exactly how they're behaving in the market. We can see here the most common THC amount in pack, not surprising probably to most of you, is 100 milligrams with 10 pieces per pack. So aligning pretty closely to what we saw, which they prefer between 5 and 20 milligrams per dose. And they're thinking about THC content in the total pack, and they're thinking about the price for that THC. So all of that really matters in ensuring that you enter the market in the right way. And further, let's just take a quick look, because as I mentioned, we have this down to the SKU level, thinking about what are those attributes, what are those products. This is a quick look at the top 3 gummy SKUs in Arizona. And you can see here, they all align with exactly what we unpacked between the consumer data and the retail sales tracking data. All right, so form factor, an anchor for consumer strategy and brand strategy. But you want to go deeper beyond just what do they prefer and what's those simple reasons why they purchase what they purchase. That is especially true when you see purchase influencers like THC content and pricing. That's not very helpful in building a strong brand and brand strategy, whether that's product portfolio management or assortment if you're a retailer. So worry about the details. Unpack why they're consuming what they're consuming and when. Get smarter about talking to them, get smarter about your brand positioning, get smarter about bud tender training, because all of that will drive incremental purchases and it will grow your consumer base as well. So in this case, again, the why and the when of Arizona edible consumers, keeping a very high level, again, not surprising to most, but number 1 reason, sleep better for consuming edibles, relieve pain, and then relax, be mellow. And so this preference of kind of why, or those primary reasons for why they consume, aligns very closely with that need state or occasion or that day part of consumption. Also important to think about the frequency of consumption. Not surprising, the more frequent the consumption, the more frequent the shopper, meaning the more they're spending on your brand and the more they're spending in your stores. So the next layer of element here is to think, how do we dissect that edible consumer profile or that edible consumer target in Arizona further? And one way to do that is to think about those heavier consumers. What do they look like? How do they think? How do they behave differently than the average edible consumer? That's a key way to differentiate your products and your product strategy. As many of you know, those heaviest consumers are still driving a lot of volume in this industry across all form factors. Next, we might want to look, again, worry about those details. Think about those purchase influencers. You saw on a prior slide, I had already screenshotted the top 3 reasons for people consuming or purchasing. What are those top 3 purchase influencers? But break that down further. Look at what else matters to them. Familiarity of a brand, familiarity of a strain, a familiar or credible recommendation from a friend, family member, bud tender. These things matter to people. And so as you enter the Arizona market within edibles, how do you think about that strategy? How do you make sure that your brand is offering and providing the information, the education, the recommendations that consumers are looking for right now? In addition to high THC content and price, taste or flavor is always going to pop because this is an ingestible product. We see that even in non-infused food categories, obviously, but really breaking this down further. And again, you can see this cutoff because these are screenshots and we don't want to give away everything. So again, worry about the details. Know who these people are. Understand why they're consuming what they're consuming. What's that need state or occasion of consumption? Really to enter a market with the strongest position possible. Don't copy and paste what is working in one market and assume it's going to work in another state or country. Last thing, what are you up against? Second to last thing, actually. What are you up against? So now we're looking at Arizona. We could break down the Arizona market, look at top brands, look at top products, align that SKU strategy appropriately, unpack white space opportunities. What are current brands and players in the market not offering consumers? Moving in from, Arizona from California. I think we could all agree California in a lot of cases is a leading indicator of trends that we then see come to life in other markets. So California is a bit of a catalyst. What's happening in California in terms of solvent lists or strains or low dose microdosing or minor cannabinoids or ratios, you name it? Think about that and figure out what is that right strategy for entering a new market. Also important to call out, how many brands are you up against? And what do those look like? And so this is a quick view of Arizona edible brand availability. So if we think about the Arizona edible brands available in the market, how available are they? What points of distribution are they getting? So entering this market as a net new brand, you're up against 7 brands that have statewide availability, meaning they're basically available in almost every store within Arizona. Then we go to widely available, somewhat available, and most limited. What are you up against here? What is your distribution strategy? What stores are you going to target? How are you going to prioritize this? Is this a mainstream product and brand that should be in every store? Or do you need to be much more specific and prioritize stores that have greater velocities or that are appealing to the same shoppers and consumers that your brand attracts? Also, drilling down and taking a look at how many innovations within edibles have shown up and at the product and the brand level in Arizona in the last 90 days. What are those innovations? Are they from established brands or new brands? How much do they sell in the first 3 months? Always useful, obviously, to set the strategy, enter the market, set the KPIs and track against them. And a lot of this can be built out by what's currently happening in the marketplace to set realistic expectations. So on the topic, as I mentioned before, about knowing and going deeper with understanding these consumers or shoppers or targets, there's not enough time in the day to go through all of the different data sets. So I just wanted to show you visually an example. So if you're anchoring in a behavior, consumption dynamics, heavy, medium, and light, or form factors, just because you're saying, I want to look at, let's use an example, heavier consumers who prefer edibles and their primary use case is to sleep in Arizona. It's not just defining those characteristics, it's then unpacking who are they? What's that demographic profile of that consumer you just defined? How are they behaving? How are they shopping? What other products outside of cannabis do they consume? How do they think about their personal health? What activities do they participate in? So even separate from just their cannabis consumption and their behaviors within this industry, who are they? So there's so much more to unpack here and that you have to understand as you think about building out these consumer or shopper targets. It makes it much easier to anchor your brand development or your product development to a core focus. Obviously, you always want to size that group and validate that they're a large enough group to anchor in. And then you're always going to get halo outside of that group if you're building a product that appeals to the needs of people. So again, consider not just form factor, spend, heavy, medium, and light, but then really unpack, even if those are your definitions, unpack who these people are holistically. And again, we can help you along the way across the board and kind of pulling not just kind of these consumer profiles and behaviors, but also, as I've shown in this presentation, mapping that back to what's actually happening in the market, what brands, what trends, what products, what attributes are trending. Also, all of this, the consumer behavior is an indicator of the size of the market over the next 5 years. So a really great prediction of kind of increased growth and not just, as I mentioned, the percent of the population consuming, but what form factors they consume, for what need states or occasions, and how frequently. All of this driving clear indication of growth in the marketplace over time. So unpacking all of that really briefly, think about, again, this example, which is really about anchoring a brand or a product into a consumer target. Expanding a brand from one state to another isn't a copy and paste exercise. Unpack what's happening in the market. What are your brand strengths? What do you bring to that market? And build that strategy to make sure you're optimizing your SKU assortment. You're prioritizing your SKU assortment as you go into retailers. You're tackling the right retailers and suggesting the right products. You're training and educating those retailers, or you're training and educating the consumer on the brand and kind of what the product's offering them, setting up brand messaging and marketing to align closely with whoever that anchor consumer target is. So just thinking about these solutions in more depth, everything I showed you via screenshots is coming directly from BDSA's Trended Consumer Insights. This is, as I mentioned before, proprietary research we conduct every 6 months, drillable by geography, demographics, behaviors, channels, med versus adult use, reasons why people consume, easily drillable, filterable down to shoppers. So thinking about flipping from a consumer lens to a dispensary shopper lens, and so on. Everything I showed you is dynamically available in the dashboards. Consumer segmentation. That last slide I showed of those profiles was actually one of BDSA's consumer segments. So BDSA has taken all of the trended consumer research we have, and we have conducted a true attitudinal consumer segmentation. It is a cluster-based analysis that results in 6 mutually exclusive consumer segments and 4 mutually exclusive non-consumer segments, broken down by state, also looking at them trended, and understanding of those 6 consumer segments, Who exactly are they? What are they buying? How do they behave? Who are they demographically, attitudinally, behaviorally? You name it, profiling them. It is a very robust model to think about identifying target consumer groups, sizing them, validating them, and profiling them. So a big opportunity there. And the last thing I'll call out, custom consumer solutions. So we are sitting on so much consumer and shopper data. So while we have syndicated services that make it easy and quick to subscribe and access, there's so many opportunities to dive into this further with many of our most sophisticated retail and brand clients. We can define and validate your segments for you. We can customize this completely. We can overlay consumer, shopper, and store segmentations together so that there's one holistic strategy across both the retail and wholesale brand organizations if you're a vertical operator. You name it, a lot of solutions here. So hopefully you all got a quick understanding of kind of what's all available. Hopefully you learned a little bit along the way about what's happening right now in Arizona and what are those trends. As I mentioned before, our next webinar is March 21st. We will be covering, as I mentioned, the updated global market forecast. So definitely put that on your calendar. This session will be recorded. If you have questions or thoughts, definitely reach out to us and look forward to hearing with you. Thank you.